Okay, I think we'll make a start. Everyone's settled. You're all very welcome. You're all very welcome to this afternoon's seminar, which is also a celebratory event. It's a book launch. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Gray. I'm the director of the Institute for Irish Studies here in Queen's. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to what is our first meeting of our seminar series this semester. This is a hybrid event, so we have an audience online who I hope can hear me, as well as an audience in the room. It is a kind of slightly discriminatory event in that we can only provide wine afterwards to the people who are here on the room. So sorry, everyone who's joining us online. You have to find your own alcoholic refreshment at the end of the event. So the format is I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is going to introduce the book that we're launching today. Dr. Sophie Cooper, and then the author of the book, Professor Sean Connolly, is going to then follow with a few words, and then we'll adjourn for some refreshment. So without further ado, let me introduce Sophie Cooper. It's a great pleasure to have Sophie here with us this afternoon. She's been kind of jet-setting around various counties in the south of Ireland over the last few days, and she's made it back to Belfast. So Dr. Sophie Cooper is a lecturer in liberal arts here at Queen's University Belfast in School of Arts, English and Languages. She's a social and cultural historian of Ireland and the Irish diaspora, with a particular interest in gender, religion and urban space, primarily working on the 19th century, but also now moving into the 20th century as well. Her previous work has been comparative, focusing particularly on the United States and Australia, and specifically on the cities of Melbourne and Chicago in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this led to her first publication, her first monograph publication, with the title Forging Identities in the Irish World, Melbourne and Chicago, circa 1830 to 1922, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in February of this year, which is doing very well and has been well reviewed so far. It's a great piece. Wasn't that ominous? You know, it's like, what have you written? Oh, sorry, I wasn't trying to put you off, Sophie. Okay, and then Sophie's current work is moving into the study of women religious, nuns in particular, in and outside Ireland, women in public space in the built environment in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also on the histories of emotion in the built environment. She's secretary of the Ulster Society for Irish Historical Studies, and also the reviews editor for the Australasian Journal of Irish Studies. So I'm going to pass over to Sophie now, who's going to introduce On Every Tide, the making and remaking of the Irish world.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Sean for giving me the opportunity to read this. As you can see, I mean, I would say I'm an expert on the Irish diaspora, or at least some of it, but you'll see from my post-it notes that this has got something for everyone. The way that it brings things together is fascinating. And I was reminded of something John Berger said, that to emigrate is always to dismantle the centre of the world, and so to move into a lost, disoriented one of fragments. And I think that is kind of what a survey book such as this really helps us to do. We hear so much about the Irish in one place or another. There's obviously more and more comparative works being done, but this helps to kind of pull the more general ideas together with some really beautiful kind of individual stories. So first of all, I'll introduce Sean. So as many of you will know here, Sean Connolly is Professor Emeritus, which I always struggle saying, of Irish history here at Queen's, and has a long and much lauded career at Queen's, and before that at Ulster University and Proning. A historian of Ireland, and particularly its religious and political contexts. I know that Sean's works are touchstones for many of us. especially through his edited works and the Oxford Companion to Irish History, which one of my housemates did pour wine all over, but has survived in its kind of red wine stained form, and which I frequently return to. And everyone that I've mentioned that I'm introducing this to has raised that companion, and also Sean's work on priests and politics. With On Every Tide, Sean's joined a growing chorus of scholars in focusing on the Irish diaspora. And in this book, which is aimed at a popular audience, a much needed kind of book for a popular audience, he presents us with an important survey of those who left Ireland from the early 19th century up until around 2020. The focus is on kind of periods of very high emigration, particularly from the 1840s until the early 1900s. That's probably the focus of the first 9 chapters, and then the other 7 chapters kind of take us through the 20th century. There's a range of folklore, there's literature, there's a really interesting focus on politics and culture. But what I really like is that each of the places that he focuses on, and the US is a focal point, but also there's quite a lot of, there's individual chapters on Australia, New Zealand and Canada, Great Britain. Argentina is a kind of a constant presence. All of these places are looked at, they're never approached as a homogenous space, which I think has so often been the flaw of at least national histories of the Irish diaspora. So often the Irish in Sydney, for example, is used as a shorthand for Australia, the Irish in New York, a shorthand of the US. And there's a real emphasis, there's a real priority of bringing together different snapshots of different places. And I think that's so key in undermining some of the old tropes about Irish diaspora history, which so often actually kind of puts people off. We don't need Gangs of New York again, but a bit more on Butte, Montana, or the Irish in San Francisco. That brings this kind of wonderful depth and variety to migration stories that we know are hugely individual. We know are hugely influenced by a range of factors, both in Ireland, on the journey, and elsewhere. And so that's what Sean does throughout this. Before this, just thinking of other survey works, I mean, Donald Harmon Atkinson's survey on the Irish diaspora in 1996 was great, but it was a primer. It was quite a lot of statistics. It was designed to be an inspiration for further research. So that is more of a kind of a general one, and it's a great one to go back to. But a similar thing for Dave Fitzpatrick's brilliant work on Irish emigration, which again is very stat heavy, which as Sean points out in here, like it's good to have the stats, but we also need that wider context to be given, those details, because especially for a public audience, but even for me, tables of stats don't really kind of bring the magic. Turtle Bunbury has more recently compiled a collection of emigrant stories for a public audience, and there's but again, these are kind of snapshots, whereas this makes a concerted effort to kind of bring a wider story together. And I do think this the narrative, the voice of Sean throughout is really important, especially this kind of regarding the responsibility of maybe not a public historian, but a historian for the public. Throughout this, the prejudices that Irish migrants faced, they're acknowledged in different ways. The class, especially on religion, those things are all acknowledged. But there is a very strong message throughout, and quite explicitly at some points, where Irish migration history has so recently been kind of weaponized by white supremacist groups, the far right. And I think Sean is very careful and clear to say there was a huge amount of prejudice against Irish Catholics. It is not the same as the structural racism that was suffered by Indigenous peoples and African Americans. And I really appreciated that kind of voice. That might just be the woke lefty academic that the Daily Mail is screaming about in me. But I do think, especially for a book for a public audience, that's kind of crucial. So there's been more and more diaspora history written. I mean, Cian McMahon's recent book, Coffin Ship, which Sean kind of grapples with. I particularly liked the fact that you grappled with quite like the mechanics of the ships at different times. So there is that focus on the actual transport vessels. But Cian kind of brings together the networks across North America and Australia, but again, in quite a different way and in a very specific time. Cian only really looks at the famine years effectively, whereas, as I've said, Sean's book spreads across. And speaking of spreading across, that's a weird thing to focus on, but this is very much a history of the Irish diaspora of the entire island of Ireland. Catholics and Protestants are put side by side. People from Belfast are placed next to people from Cork, and that is so often, I think, a flaw. I know it's something that people have pointed out with my book, that it's top heavy with relation to Catholics, but throughout this, you know, talking about associational culture, the experience of people from a range of religions and a range of geographical backgrounds are kind of grappled with. And yeah, throughout this, there is just a grappling with the tensions and the kind of hypocrisies, but also those kind of opportunities. I mean, I mentioned Thomas Francis Meagher giving, you know, one of the leaders of the Irish brigades during the US Civil War, mentioning in a speech to Union soldiers that, you know, his thoughts also went to John Mitchell, whose sons were fighting for the Confederates. These kind of tensions across the Irish diaspora and within very specific communities. So yes, a lot of the Irish diaspora books have focused on they've been mainly edited collections, which brings this kind of tapestry of Irish diaspora experiences. But because Sean has such a strong voice throughout all of this, though he obviously builds on the research of many and his own original work as well, it does give just that kind of that authoritative voice, which I think is needed when dealing with a subject with so many kind of tensions. So I thought I'd mention one of the examples from the book. I particularly liked the focus on John Doughty, who was a Belfast man who Sean believes is Protestant, who in 1848 was working as a railway superintendent in Pennsylvania. However, after being threatened by some of my countrymen from the south, accepted a 9-month engagement on a whaling ship sailing from Connecticut. He spent 15 months hunting in the waters of New Zealand and in the Arctic before, quite unceremoniously, I must say, before he's dumped in Hawaii. He then goes to San Francisco to search for gold. That didn't work out, it was too early. So he decided to become a coffee supplier back in Hawaii. But he was blown up.
He broke his leg.
Yes. And so he went back to Hawaii and became to recover, and then became a caretaker at a missionary station in Honolulu. By 1860, he was believed dead by his family, but he had left that family in Baltimore. So he's another one example of many that kind of highlights that this migration is not just a journey from one place to another, but it's a journey from one place to another and then another and another. So Sean's book mirrors this wide and varied kind of network of knowledge and exchange that existed throughout the Irish world during the 19th, 20th centuries, and I think helps readers to really kind of place themselves, their research, even if it, regardless of what kind of research that is, and their local context into it. Yeah, I also like that there's the kind of traditional emphasis on the kind of the great men, but there is more emphasis on everyone else. Like, we've got enough stuff on the Charles Gavin Duffy, not to choose a favourite, but there are men, there are women, there are children, there's the children that are born on the ships to Australia acknowledge the fact that 1 in 7 died on the ship during the 19th century. There's this the difference of experiences, but also that acknowledgement. And I mean, that is a frequent issue, I believe, with some Irish diaspora history, in that men and women are kind of falsely separated in the writing of these histories, whereas men and women do kind of appear together throughout this. This also means that there's an opportunity to really delve into class politics, so trade unionism comes up throughout the book. Especially, there are 2 specific chapters on American politics, Irish American politics. But I really enjoyed the consideration of, what skill means, and the kind of questioning of power and trade networks, which I know is an emphasis for Sean. I also thought the focus on the kind of problematizing of Tammany Hall was really interesting. Jane Addams kind of the great reformer, talks about Tammany Hall as kind of being, it's a politics of kindness, effectively, which I thought was a really interesting way of thinking about the derogatorily called machine politics. And I did think about kind of Irish politics in relation to that. I mean, the Healy Rays are constantly getting re-elected, and a lot of that is that kind of understanding of local kind of kindness, regardless of, if you agree with that understanding of kindness, but that these are kind of people who are working to improve the lives of the working classes, and not applying the category of deserving poor versus undeserving poor, and not just applied to Irish migrants, but actually taking people as they come. And I thought that was an important intervention, which so often our critique of Tammany Hall politics and machine politics is kind of mixed up in it used to be a shorthand for anti-Irishness. So actually reframing this in a politics of kindness is an important thing to do. And there's a lot about politics in here, but not to an overwhelming degree. And it also, one difficulty of writing diaspora history is that you often become an expert in very specific things, and you're not sure who your audience is. Not to make it about me, but I remember in one of the reviews of when I was first putting my book proposal out, I was told by one reviewer that it would be really useful if I learned something about American history, and the other historian felt that there wasn't enough Australia in it. So you constantly come up against this critique that you're not doing enough. And I think the accessibility of Sean's writing means that even if you're not an expert on the Democratic Party in Boston, or if you're not an expert on the workhouse girls who went to Australia in the 1840s, you can still engage with the arguments and the ideas. Going towards the end of the book, we kind of move through the 20th century and this kind of the idea of how much identity and allegiance to an Irish identity shifts, especially when you have this drop off of large scale migration. So when you are when it's the children and grandchildren of migrants, how does that change engagement with Irish identity and also Irish associational culture? And I thought the character of Ireland in this was really interesting. That kind of romanticization of Ireland at times, but also when Ireland as its own state becomes a voice in making the Irish world. I did think, so there's one chapter on Northern Ireland, well, in American interventions in Northern Ireland, and I did love the kind of well, the generational divides that we see kind of emerging, especially when Bernadette Devlin visits the US in 1969, and she caused absolute outrage by supporting the Black Civil Rights movement and also not showing true kind of expected deference to Richard Daley, the Chicago Irish mayor. So this kind of moments where this imagined island from afar, which is often homogenized, kind of comes into conflict with the realities and priorities of those living actually on the island. And I think America's role and continuing role in Northern Ireland especially is particularly interesting and something that we can continue to ponder. Especially when thinking about the competing spheres of influence within Ireland. I mean, this isn't just a Northern Irish thing. You look at down south, the influence of multinationals, and as Sean points out, Ireland's current relationship is with corporate America rather than Irish America, at least at a governmental kind of strategy level, and how those kind of how those structural versus individual networks of influence shift over time is something that's really nicely drawn out. I don't know how much longer you want me to speak for, Peter.
As long as you want.
But I know I focused on the US, but that isn't to say that this book does. There are just really interesting stuff on New Zealand, and especially how Irishness is understood in New Zealand, and kind of the different structures that are at play in Australia versus New Zealand, and the and how differently. Well, New Zealand's always like there's a lot more kind of wealth that goes into New Zealand. So whereas people who are going to Australia spend a lot of time, we're in Australia, we're not in Ireland. This needs to shift my thinking. And there's also this kind of variety of class experience in Australia. New Zealand, there tends to be a lot more success very quickly. That continues, which kind of does stick with my idea of New Zealand as kind of this paradise for all. But we don't tend to hear that much about New Zealand. There's very little, well, I don't think there are any books, maybe one or two books on the Irish in New Zealand. It tends to be kind of the forgotten, like there's some really good, oh no, there's one. But there's some really good articles on New Zealand, but having that integrated into the story is really useful. Canada, and especially the conflicts between Quebec and the rest of Canada, and how that played out within the Catholic school system. Again, really useful and really interesting. So yeah, I've kind of focused on the bits that I was really interested in, but I think that's my prerogative as the one who's introducing it. Yeah, especially if you're interested in the kind of occupational links, the economic stuff, but without it being an economic history. Like, I love economic history that doesn't seem like economic history. That just seems like social and cultural history. That's my favorite kind of economic history, but it's throughout this book. So you are really grappling with trade union networks, with occupational networks, but also how that plays out in how people settle across cities, across states, across countries, and the different opportunities that provides. The land is very prominent in this book, the way that people control land. But actually, the thing that I really liked was that so often in diaspora histories, you see that Irish people are moved onto rural lands and it fails. So the Irish are scared of the land. It rejected them, so they rejected it. A common trope. But what Sean actually points out is that we're expecting no learning curve. Whereas actually, if you look at the people who are hugely successful in the West, like in the prairies or in Australia, working the land, they're the people that have probably worked the land in different places over time. They've probably come from Ireland, taken the skills that they've got from working the land there, then moved to a semi-settled area, then moved further and further. I think so often we expect people to adapt immediately, and that just isn't how people work. So yes, there are some very successful landowners in this, but the same landowners who become very successful later also have to be taught how to milk a cow, because in Ireland that was women's work, but they had moved out as a single man to the West. And so actually acknowledging that these things are learning curves, that people are on both a mental and emotional journey as well as a physical one, is important in how we rate the success and failures of Irish migrants abroad, and also how we visualize the whole of the Irish world. So all I will say further to this is that it's from Little Brown, but it's available there, and it's £25, so you should buy it for everyone for their Christmas presents. So yes, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie, for introducing On Every Tide. My role really next was to introduce Sean, but Sophie's already done that. So no, let me just say this. Lesser historians, such as myself, tend to get our teeth into a particular time and place and set of themes in a historical topic and kind of dig deeper. Sean, on the other hand, has an incredible range with regard both to the history of Ireland and to the history of Ireland's place in the world and relations with other parts of the world, starting off initially with the history of religion and priests and people in pre-famine Ireland in the early 19th century, moving back into the early 18th century with his study of the Irish Protestant elite and also cultural figures within that milieu, such as Swift. Moving even further back into the 16th century with his 2-volume History of Early Modern Ireland, running from, I think, 1530? 1460, sorry. I mean, that whole century back, 15th century rather than 16th century, and running right the way through to 1800. And then moving from the kind of pre-industrial, pre-modern Ireland into the kind of industrializing shock city that was Belfast. In its industrialized heyday, and afterwards Sean edited which the book that in some ways is the official history of Belfast, Belfast 400, which came out to mark the 400th anniversary of the granting of the charter to the city in 1613. And from studying Belfast and its social, economic, cultural history, Sean has then leapt out into the study which we're launching today, looking at Irish emigration across a long period, a longue durée, from the 17th and 18th centuries through to contemporary history, and diasporically covering every part of the world where the Irish have ended up for one reason or another. It's an extraordinary piece of work coming, as a summation. Maybe there's more to come. I don't know. But to kind of say that's it, you're finished. But maybe not. I mean, maybe there's another big project to follow. But this is an extraordinary summation to a long and extremely significant career in Irish history across many aspects and many chronological periods. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Sean, who's going to say a few words about the book and how it's come about.
Thanks, Peter. Well, first, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Peter and Sophie for their extremely generous remarks. They're very generous remarks because On Every Tide is not a research monograph. Be better described as an essay. At least essay sounds better than Aging Chancellor's Last Desperate Potboiler, which I know is the view of at least one reviewer. Yeah, it is an essay. Having worked for the best part of 40 years on different versions of identity within Ireland, this is an attempt to ask what happens to those identities when they are transported outside Ireland. I won't say very much, but just briefly to say where this work has taken me. I think of it as the story I have to tell is really coming in 3 chapters. The first is about the early decades of mass emigration. And what I'm trying to show there is that this movement of the Irish, first to Great Britain and then to North America from the from the late 18th century in the case of Great Britain, is important because the Irish are pioneers of a wholly new type of population movement. I only realized this when I read the celebrated report on the Irish in Great Britain, published in 1834 by George Cornwall Lewis. Now, a lot of people have read this report, but I think a lot of people don't see beyond Lewis's fairly conventional early Victorian prejudices and his rather chauvinistic assessment of the Irish as idle, feckless, unsuited for skilled work, and responsible largely for their own debased condition in Great Britain. And certainly that is one side of Lewis's report. But he was also extremely perceptive. And he did recognise 2 things. First of all, that the presence of the Irish in Scotland and England was absolutely crucial to the economic transformation that was taking place around him, what we now call the Industrial Revolution. He openly says we could not have done it without all this manual labour. And secondly, he's absolutely clear that this is something without historical precedent. Okay, people have always crossed the oceans, but generally speaking, long distance migration up to this point had been people coming from advanced, powerful societies and imposing themselves on more vulnerable populations elsewhere, as for example with the Spaniards in Central and South America. This was different. This was rich countries, Great Britain and the United States, importing people from a poorer society to act as cheap labour in order to drive their runaway economic growth. Now, what Lewis didn't know, of course, was that where the Irish went, many others were to follow. Across the second half of the 19th, early 20th century, you're talking about 50, 60 million Indians and Chinese distributed around the Pacific Rim, all the way from East Africa to the west coast of North America. You're talking about 60 million or so Europeans, mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe, crossing the Atlantic. And then after the Second World War, former residents of the former British and French colonies imported to help to rebuild their shattered infrastructures. And same process continues today. It's spread to other parts of the world. So you now get poor countries like Bangladesh supplying cheap labour to the oil-rich states in the Middle East and to the Asian tiger states like Singapore. So one point to make is that when we look at the Irish diaspora, we are looking at the pioneers of a mass movement that has transformed the modern world. The other advantage of looking at this mass Irish emigration to Great Britain and particularly to the United States in terms of the import of cheap labour is that when we look at the grim conditions endured by these Irish migrants, we don't have to succumb to some special Irish narrative of victimhood or follow Kirby Miller in theorising about what Don Atkinson has called the Gaelic Catholic disability that stops people prospering. The fate of the Irish in the United States is easily understood as the fate everywhere of migrants imported as cheap labour. It is to do the work that nobody else wants to do for low wages and often in atrocious conditions, while simultaneously being reviled within the host society as a threat to its morals and its civilization. That's true today as it was in Boston or anywhere else in the 1850s. And that same perspective, seeing the fate of the Irish in the United States as tied to their role as cheap labour, it also explains the very different experience of the much smaller numbers of Irish who went to other destinations, to Canada, to New Zealand, to Australia. Because there, they were not arriving to be slotted in at the bottom of an already well-established social hierarchy. And they didn't face a well-entrenched native working class determined to keep them in their place. Instead, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they were arriving at societies that were still in the process of construction. And they still faced ethnic and religious prejudice, but there were not the same obstacles to establishing themselves at every level of these social hierarchies as they took shape. In Ontario, for example, in the 1870s, the Irish, Catholic and Protestant were the wealthiest ethnic group in farming, for example. And that also explains why the Irish in Australia, New Zealand and Canada don't develop the same tribal defensiveness that the Irish do in the United States, and the same support for militant Irish nationalism. Instead, they're, for the most part, willing to take pride in their role as co-founders of successful colonies within the British Empire. Okay, that's chapter 1. Second chapter is the advance of the Irish from in the most important destination in the United States from their initial disadvantaged position, which takes place fairly quickly. By the end of the 19th century, if you take the first and second generations together, that's the immigrants and their immediate descendants, then the occupation profile of the Irish is broadly the same as that of the native-born white population. And of course, famously, by this time, the Irish have established themselves as a powerful force in key areas of American life, in the labor movement, in municipal politics, and also in the Catholic Church, where at the end of the 19th century, 2/3 of American bishops are Irish by birth or by descent. There's still a degree of ethnic stereotyping, but the savage criticism you saw in, say, the 1840s, 50s is giving way to more humorous satire. And if you move forward another half century to a film like Hollywood's Going My Way in 1944, with Bing Crosby as the affable, worldly wise Father Chuck O'Malley sorting out the problems of an inner city parish, you can see American Catholicism has been fully absorbed into the mainstream. Now, this is all a familiar story, and the reasons for this success is also familiar. The Irish arrive in the United States without marketable skills, in most cases with very little capital, but they have two great advantages: their familiarity with the political institutions and political systems that they're going to encounter, and the fact that most of them, even those whose first language is Irish, have a command of English. But one of the things I realized, working on the book, is that the role of language is particularly important. We tend to think of it in terms of politics, for example. Yes, the Irish can make their way in urban politics because they speak the language. But it's also important in so many other ways. The fact that the Irish are English speaking, for example, helps to explain why, contrary to what a lot of people assume, in a city like Boston in the late 19th century, of all the ethnic groups, the Irish are actually the least ghettoized. Next to the English, they are most evenly distributed across the city. And that's because, yes, like other immigrant groups, they like to live close to their fellow countrymen, but they don't have the same absolute need to live in specific areas where people will understand what they're saying. Another very telling example, mid-19th century America has a proliferation of ethnic newspapers, and many of these newspapers are dailies. On the other hand, the main Irish newspapers, like the Irish World, are weeklies. And the reason for this, as Patrick Ford, the proprietor of the Irish World, noted, was that the Irish read the ordinary local American press wherever they live. And then they want to read an Irish newspaper once a week to get a distinctively Irish slant on what they've been reading. And if you think about the contrast between that, between somebody reading their local San Francisco Chronicle or whatever, and then picking up the Irish World on a Saturday to get a specifically Irish slant, and contrast that with somebody whose whole window on the world is through a German or a Yiddish newspaper, you can see the difference. My third chapter, in metaphorical terms, is about the extraordinary afterlife of the Irish diaspora, because overseas migration from Ireland largely comes to an end in the 1920s. Ireland still needs to export huge numbers of people, but they generally go no further than Great Britain. With the onset of the Depression, emigration to America falls away to an insignificant level. And yet, a whole century later, after the end of this, of the Irish diaspora proper, Ireland's international profile remains remarkably high. And as proof of this, I would cite a recent publication. The very latest Peppa Pig. Peppa and her family travel to Ireland to take part in an Irish dancing competition. The point cannot be made any more clearly. So Ireland retains this remarkably high international profile. But what you've got here, I'll be brief here, is a very complex story of continuity adaptation. Obviously, the high level of international interest in all things Irish is connected to the deep cultural footprint left by generations of Irish immigrants, spread to North America, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand. But on the other hand, if you look at the Irishness, which is marketed today, Brand Ireland, it is an Irishness which is adapted to the needs of a modern international market, and which is a long way removed from the cultural and mental world of the immigrants of the 19th and early 20th century. I mean, to give you the simplest example, if you were to take the founder of the Irish state, Eamon de Valera, Patrick Pearse, and so on, what would they say if they knew that today the internationally recognized symbol of the republic they sought to create is the Irish pub? From the Leaping Leprechaun in San Francisco to Molly Malone's in Hiroshima, the Irish pub exists in major cities throughout the world. Projecting an image of Ireland, which is highly successful as a society with deep roots and tradition, but also totally at ease with itself and in interaction with the outside world, and characterized by a sort of genial secular hedonism. A long way, as I say, from the world of the actual Irish diaspora. So, as in so many other aspects of Irish history, the links between the past and the present are there, but they are by no means straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. We don't, because this is a book launch event, we don't have a formal kind of Q&A session today, but you will have an opportunity to talk to Sean now. I mean, we're going to have a break now to have a glass of wine and to have some conversation. So if you want to talk to Sean about his book or have any questions for him, you will be very happy to answer them.
I'll do my best.
We also have our good friend David Torrance from No Alibis Bookshop at the back here. David has got a large number of copies of On Every Tide at a discounted price, both paperback and hardback. So if you'd like to pick up a copy, David will be more than happy, or sorry, David's colleague, David's gone now, will be more than happy to sell you a copy. So thank you all very much for coming. Just before we break up, just to let you know, we do have another seminar next Monday at 4:30 in this room and also online. It's our own Dr. Brian E. Widdis, who's a research fellow here in the School of HAP, working on a project looking at the colonial dimensions of the collections of the Ulster Museum. And Brian E. will be speaking on the subject of the finest war canoe in Europe, John Casement, displacement and ethnographic histories in Belfast. We're very happy if as many people as possible can come and join us at 4:30 next Monday afternoon for that, both in the room and also online. But let me just finish by inviting you to thank both Sophie and Sean for speaking about the book On Every Tide and to show our appreciation